who would create organizations like this. But there were a lot of organizations that were involved in charity, although they weren't charitable organizations. So, for example, Lugang was a trading town. It was one of the dominant ports dealing with trade between Taiwan and mainland China. It was a trading town, and so it was dominated by merchant associations. You know, the Cloth Dealers Association, the Association of People Who Trade with Xiamen, a city in the mainland, and so forth. All of these did charitable activities. All of them. They settled disputes. They gave help to the poor when they had some medical emergency. They gave cash gifts to old people at Chinese New Year's or at the holiday where you honor your ancestors. They just did all kinds of things. That's the first observation. The second observation is every important social organization was a religious organization. They're not distinguishable. And partly they're not distinguishable in Chinese. That is, the term 宗教, the term that translates religion in Chinese, was introduced into China in the early 20th century from Japanese, like almost the entire social science vocabulary that we have, from Japanese, which was translating European or American terms. The Chinese instead would talk about worshiping, which is what temple religion did, or teachings, which temple religion didn't really have, but Buddhism or Christianity or Confucianism, we can argue about whether Confucianism is a religion by Western standards, but no one would argue that Confucianism is not a teaching. Right? Confucianism was a teaching. It is a line of knowledge passed down over generations. So what did we have in Lugang? We had what they called Shen Ming Hui locally, God associations. Every association was a God association. In fact, in Lugang, even lineages, that mainstay of Chinese social structure, even lineages were organized as God-worshipping associations, not ancestor-worshipping, but God-worshipping associations. Guilds were, merchant associations were, temples were. And this was a legal form, the God Association. We registered with the government, with a charter, as a God Association. So of these 19th century merchant associations, for instance, only one still survives, the one that traded with the city of Quanzhou in China. And they have a nice brochure, and you open to page 1, and there's a picture of their altar. The very first thing they want you to know is what gods they worship. And you walk into their guild hall, and the first thing you see is their altar with their gods. In fact, so Taiwan, as you know, maybe, was taken over by the Japanese in 1895. It was a Japanese colony for 50 years. But the good thing about colonialism for people like me is they tend to keep really good records. So in 1923, they did a census of all the God associations in Lugang. There were 66. A town of 20,000. There were 66 God associations. So it was really important. And the other important thing there was the leaderships interlocked. That is, for the local elite, you needed to be involved in the committees that ran local temples, that is, in pure religious things. You needed to be involved in these guilds or merchant associations. You needed to be involved in the lineage association. They did all of these things. And it's still true. It's still true today. So in fact, what started me in on this was an accidental conversation I had with a man who turned out to be the grandson of one of the last imperial degree holders in this town of Lugang, a Qingshi holder, which is a fairly high degree. And he had been able to refurbish his grandfather's house, which still stood, as a kind of touristy sort of a place, but I ran into him sitting there, and so I started interviewing. What else can you do? I started interviewing him, and he gave me his name card, and there, he had this historical thing he was doing, and there it said, past chairman of the Kiwanis Club, member of the temple committee of some temple, and he'd been village head in the past. That is still today. It's true that if you want to be a local big man, you need to be involved in all of these different organizations. One sign of that was these Kiwanis and things. If it's West Lafayette, there's one, right? So there was 4 Kiwanis clubs in this town of 20,000. There was 2 Lions clubs, 2 Rotary clubs, and what's the other one? Junior Chamber of Commerce. There's 3 junior chambers of commerce. Why? Because you have to have an organization if you want to be a local leader. So the ties with religion, and sometimes it was Presbyterians, but sometimes, more often, it was these local temples. It's all interlocked. That's been true. That's a historical pattern. So what do we see? What's the relationship then in the 19th century between public good, philanthropy, and religion? Totally intertwined. You just can't separate. And that's why, in some sense, my initial idea, the whole thing about it's changed so much since the 1970s, what this makes me think is, well, yeah, it has. That observation wasn't wrong. But the weird thing that needs explaining isn't how in 2008 we have temples involved with doing good. The thing that needs explaining now is why in 1978 did we not have that? Because that turns out to be Chinese tradition. Well, so let me answer that question by going back to Japan's census of the God associations in 1923. They took a census, there were 66, and then they said, good, now we know you can't do this anymore. The God association will no longer be a legally recognized form of association. So in fact, they still exist, but they're not legally recognized, right? They have no government recognition. Why would they do that? The reason is they're a modern state. And by modern, I don't mean that they do modern things. I mean, ideologically, they're modern, right? They think of themselves as a modern state, and one of the characteristics there is a separation of religion and state. Now, of course, it's Japan. We're about to see a reintegration to the Shinto, right? But not quite yet. Not quite yet. Certainly not in Taiwan. Now they're saying, this stuff you people do, whatever it is, which is rather different from anything in Japan, it doesn't count. You can't do it that way. If you're going to have a social organization, yeah, you can do that, but you have to organize it in a modern way, with a charter and a board of directors and no gods. So that, you can just put a date on this moment of secularization, 1923. And here, let me point out, I don't mean secularization the way secularization theory talks about it. That is, as a decline of religiosity that you get with modernity. There's no evidence for that. Not for any of these places, really. Rather, it's a state policy that religion has to be kept locked up in its own sphere. Religion does its religion thing, and everything else has to be done outside of religion. That idea, and really, 1923, for Lugong at least, that's the day. What's happening on the mainland at that time? The Republic of China government, right? This is before the revolution, the Republic of China. They're really not